My goal for the Middle Ages is that we, in general, have a sense of what the Middle Ages were, but in general, there isn't a cohesive one style that the Middle Ages really embody. So we're going to talk about Byzantium in the East, and we're going to talk about the Middle Ages in the West, but only in the most broad terms, particularly because I would like to consolidate these two items for 4.1 and 4.2 into essentially one day's worth of homework. So I'm going to move through this fairly quickly. Realize that all you need to understand for the most part is the general sense of style in Byzantine costume and general sense of style in Byzantine architecture. There's a few terms that I would like you to learn, and those will become clear. But outside of that, we're glossing over so much time in history. I do not want you to stress too much about this time period. So Rome was a long time in dying. Even in the 5th and 6th centuries AD, many Roman organizational methods, institutions, and ideas still influenced the cultural life around the Mediterranean. By the beginning of the 4th century AD, however, the Roman classical outlook began to change into a medieval one. Emperor Constantine's acceptance of Christianity as the state religion and his move to the capital from Rome to Byzantium were two principal causes for this change. From this point on, Western Christianity centered in Rome gradually separated from the culturally and philosophically different Christianity centered in Byzantium. Rome still fell prey to invasions by Germanic tribes, while the Eastern, or Byzantine, part of the empire continued to grow in strength until the development of Islam in the 7th century. By this time, East and West were separate in religion and culture. The Eastern version of Christianity was based on a complete union of church and state under the control of the Byzantine emperor, while the Western version had an independent relationship with the church and state and was headed by the Bishop of Rome, an independent figure with great power. With the migration of many people throughout Europe in the first 500 years of the Christian era, the West eventually developed in a new direction with new ideals, while the East stagnated under the rigid hierarchical framework of the Byzantine imperial court. Yet this Eastern empire continually reduced in size, maintained itself until 1453, when Constantine finally fell to the Turks. So here's the map. So basically, Constantine takes Rome with him, goes here to Constantinople. What's great about Constantinople, it is one of my favorite cities in the world. I was able to go there a few years ago. You'll see some of my very own pictures in this presentation. What's great about Constantinople is it really is the crossroads between the East and West. It still to this day has strong trade routes, and it's protected by the Baltic Mountains. This is where the Greek Orthodox Church, as we know it now, began, with this East-West split I was just discussing. And in general, Constantinople was constantly at war with the Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, Avars, the Turks, and eventually the Ottoman Turks, in general. So the emperor was the head of the Eastern Church, which separated from the Church in the West in 1054. We're going to cover about 1,000 years of history very, very quickly here. So here is Constantine and his mother. I'm going to be using these ink drawings because they're a very clear, easy way to understand the costume of the period. It's extremely ornate, and it really does feel like church vestments. In 527 to 565, there's Justinian and Theodora, probably two of the most well-known Byzantine Roman emperor wife emperor duo. They tried to reclaim the West and reunite the empire, and did not end up doing that for very long. Christianity was adopted by the Roman Empire and by Constantine in 313 CE. The rituals involved in Christianity required a public gathering space, including baptisms and masses, making Christian churches more of an auditorium than the previous pagan temples that we've already looked at. So this is why, as I said earlier, the basilica became the public meeting hall that was once the Roman courtroom, now became a gathering place for Christians. And this would heavily influence the architecture of early churches, well, in really all churches in general. So you have the apses at either end here, depending on your church, but that would have statues, but would also allow for the court to sit at the end. The tribunal would generally be at the end of one of these apses. So the Roman Basilica would have an entrance on the side, aisles in the middle, and then have this apse with the tribunal at one end or both ends, depending on the basilica. And this is what an early Christian worship hall. So they kind of got used to this structural arrangement. And so what they started doing is really emphasizing the cross for obvious symbolic reasons. So this became they sort of got rid of this one end apse. So the entrance is on the end. You go through what's called the nave. This is an important word: nave, aisle, altar, transept, apse. And now where the tribunal was sitting as part of the secular government, now we have the bishop's chair and the chancel. So we will see this continue to evolve over time, particularly as we move forward into Romanesque and Gothic. But just know that. The Hagia Sophia is an early Christian basilica type church that was built specifically for this. The Hagia Sophia is located in Constantinople. This is what it looks like on the outside. The minarets were added later as it became a mosque. So let me tell you a little about the Hagia Sophia itself. So this is sort of one of those wide lens sort of photographs of it from the inside. From the date of its construction in 537 AD until 1453, it served as an Eastern Orthodox cathedral and the seat of the Patriarch of Constantinople, except between 1204 and 1261, when it was converted by the Fourth Crusaders, the really useless ones, to a Roman Catholic cathedral under the Latin Empire. The building was later converted into an Ottoman mosque from May 1453 until 1931. It was then secularized and opened as a museum on February 1935. Famous in particular for its massive dome, it is considered to be the epitome of Byzantine architecture, and is said to have changed the history of architecture. It remained the world's largest cathedral for nearly 1,000 years, until Seville Cathedral was completed in 1520. So we're going to look at a series of images, and these are photos that I took when I was there a few years ago. They were doing some reconstruction, but you can see how large the space is. You can see the people in comparison to the space itself. It also has a particular kind of column known as the Byzantine column, and you can see that they've sort of done away with the Greek orders that the Romans adopted and created a different kind of column top that's a little bit more, it's more intricate when you look at it close up, but it's more simple from a distance. It still has some scrolls and whatnot on it. The molding is extremely intricate. Look at the details here, this sort of organic, almost lace work, tracery, but you also have the egg and dart and whatnot, which is why the moldings from Unit 1 are so important. You can see how the lesbic chymation really grows into something even more organic. Hagia Sophia has quite a bit of decoration. Pretty much every square inch is covered with something amazing. There's all of this painting all along every edge, mosaicing. So some of it's mosaicing, most of it's mosaicing, but a lot of it's painting as well. So this is mosaicing. The Byzantine art style really had a lot to do with storytelling and symbols, and not so much a realistic representation of what things look like. You will often see the emperor and his wife sometimes. In this case, it's Mary, I think. You will often have the emperor paired with Jesus, because that's where he is getting his divine right to rule. Essentially, is being at the side of God Himself. The imagery, therefore, really has a lot more to do with reinforcing the power and the unification of church and state. Often you'll also see this with the emperor and his wife, often Justinian and Theodora, on either side of the Virgin Mary as well. The whole point of this is to draw attention to the higher symbolic meaning of their rule and of the world. This is some of the painting in the interior. You can see how extremely decorative and colorful it is. Again, this is also these Byzantine columns, and you can start to see how lacy they make the stone look. We still have some scrolls here. There's different variants of these, but this is essentially what they look like. Here is, again, the emperor and his wife on either side of Mary and Jesus. We've got this haloing, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Lots of mosaicing of little pieces of gold that catch the light in amazing ways. So much detail on the costume, really representing church vestments. Gold frescoing as well. So there's the mosaicing and there's also the frescoing, really meant to direct the sunlight or candlelight back down at the viewer. This is the section and ground plan of the Hagia Sophia. So there's multiple levels here. So you go upstairs and you actually look down into the main nave. And it's got this huge dome on top. So this is where we want to talk about a little bit of vocabulary. So there's multiple ways to support a dome. Here are the pendentives. So essentially you are pouring concrete in a certain way that it distributes the weight. Or you have squinches. And squinches essentially are a different way to support the dome, just with a ring essentially around the middle. So here's the dome, here's the squinch, and so this is a prime opportunity for decoration. So this is often where you have religious mosaics or religious friezes. So here's the dome, here's the pendentive of the Hagia Sophia. And this is the way that the pendentive is sending the tensile strength down to the ground to support itself. So you have these larger arches with smaller supportive arches and walkways in between. So this is the upstairs here. So you would walk upstairs and be able to look down through these arches. So here is what that dome looks like. It's really quite impressive from the opposite direction. This larger, so here is the pendentive sending the stress down into the building, into the ground. So the mosaic pieces themselves are called tessae, Tessseae. Tessae are four-sided, specifically mosaic pieces, and that's the way most of the mosaicing is done in Byzantine art. The holy aura is extremely important. This actually is something that is found in many cultures. It's really sort of gives the idea that they are descended from the sun or on high or from God. And in early Christian work and later Christian work, the halo really becomes this key Christian symbol. And so you will see it over and over and over again with any holy saints, Mary, Joseph, Jesus. There's another church, the Cora Church. I also went to this church. It has a much smaller dome. It's much more modest. It does not have the typical basilica layout, although it does have an apse. It has this sort of very circular space because it was meant for smaller gatherings, and it has different rooms for multi-purposes. This is what the inside of it looks like. The thing about Christian architecture from this time period is that a lot of it did not survive because of iconoclasm. In Islamic culture, religion, showing a figure of a person is considered to be offensive. Islamic resistance to the representation of living beings ultimately stems from the belief that the creation of living forms is unique to God, and it is for this reason that the role of images and image makers has been controversial. The strongest statements on the subject of figural depiction are made in the Hadith, the traditions of the prophets, where painters are challenged to breathe life into their creations and threatened with punishment on the Day of Judgment. The Quran is less specific, but condemns idolatry and the use of the Arabic term maker of forms, or the artist, as an epithet for God. Particularly as the result of this religious sentiment, figures in painting are often stylized, and in some cases the destruction of figurative artworks occurred. Iconoclasm was previously known in the Byzantine period, and was a feature of this time period, thus placing Islamic objection to figurative representations within a larger context. In Constantinople in particular, you will find many formerly Christian churches that have had their representations of human beings chipped away. So there was a lot of art that was lost, but in general, Byzantine art is pretty static. It's all sort of this similar style, much like what we saw in Egypt, how it was sort of adhered to a certain aesthetic. The same thing is true in medieval art, and we have a lot of it that survived in the West. And so this church in particular is extremely useful because it still has a lot of the art left. It was covered up by fabric. The same thing was true in the Hagia Sophia. It was covered up in fabric, and therefore not destroyed. And so later, when this church became secularized, they were able to uncover things. There are still places where items were chipped off and whatnot, but it still is pretty well intact. Here's another example of the Byzantine capitals. These have angels on them. Here is the dome itself. Again, you're really seeing these auras, you're seeing the angels, you're seeing the elaborate decoration, and you have the Virgin Mary and Jesus in the middle. We're really getting to see here in this dome the pendentives and how they're decorated. The detail in Jesus's face here. Some more fresco work. So this is fresco where you paint in the plaster before it's dry. This is some of the, again, the very lacy stonework. You can see here that the angels have had their faces chipped away. There's this mosaic here as well. more mosaics. I would tell you more about these, but we just simply don't have the time. The Cora Church is fascinating. You should look it up. Here's where some of the plaster has fallen away. You can see some of the structure. I threw this one in here for fun because when I was pulling photos from my trip to Istanbul, this was some old Roman battlements. It's a lookout point on the strait, Bosphorus Strait. Here is, in these areas that have this old ruins, they're just sort of sitting out places. So this was an amazing piece of molding. Got your egg and dart, and it really does look like darts here. Sometimes it just looks like points, but they really do look like darts. And this really elaborate molding that's left over, right? It's just gorgeous. So one of the videos I'm having you watch is about the creation of silk. In the 6th century, the secret of silk production was brought to the Byzantine Empire, where they gained a monopoly. So before you had to trade with China, now they established a place to create silk in Constantinople. And they began to produce silk for the Western world until the 9th century, which meant it became a little bit more common, even though it still was something only for the very most wealthy. Byzantine silk brocade used Persian design. So here is some silk brocade. See how intricate it is. And they were being influenced by the Arabian styles. And this is also where you get all this intricate, very interlaced, interwoven line. These are some Byzantine motifs. You can see the influence of the previous on the former. Sorry, on the latter. The word quatrefoil is extremely useful. It's when you have basically 4 circles that overlap. You see this common in early Christian work. Moving on to Byzantine costume, specifically, Byzantine men wore tunics that could either be short or long. Later in the empire, the longer they were, the more important the person was. Short tunics had long sleeves and were wider at the top, tapering to fit closely at the wrists. We start to see clothing become semi-fitted here, but it's also still semi-draped. We're starting to move more and more into fitted hemmed clothing the way that we think of it now. The hem of the tunic to the belt made movement easier. Clavi, so those red lines that the Roman aristocracy or citizens would wear, is now ornamental. It's still a part of the culture. People still wear them, but it does not signify that you are a member of the that you're a citizen. There's also these segmente, which are these medallions. They could be square or round, that are decorative items on the tunics. Tunics of the wealthy were decorated with horizontal and vertical bands. They were elaborately patterned with embroidery, applique, precious stones, and woven designs. But of course, no one is more decorative than the emperor and the empress. And there were certain insignia that they would have to designate them as the emperor or the empress. One of them is a pallium called a lorum, a long, narrow, heavily jeweled scarf. It would be draped center front and carried in one arm. It became a simpler panel of fabric with an opening for the head, so it was easier to wear later. And of course, they would wear crowns. This is the period where crowns in particular become that signifier of the leader. Here's an image of 10th century, so this is where it's going, emperor and empress. We have this heavily adorned fabric with precious stones, embroidery, really, really elaborate, with this lorem over his arm. The robes of the Byzantine Empire emperor were purple. This is a difficult color to come by, always was, well, maybe not always will be, but it was a difficult color to dye, and this is where the emperor himself begins to wear a very specific kind of cloak with this half circle on it in the color of purple. When we talk about women in particular, we are talking about men and women both covering their entire bodies. So really only the hands and the face are seen, because in this is the beginning of how in Christian belief system, the body is fairly simple and therefore you want to cover it up. So women wear multiple layers in particular. So they would wear their tunica and their palla, and so that these things would be continued on. But later the palla would become the dalmak, a wide-sleeved, long tunic decorated with clavi and segmente. They would be these double-layered tunics with an outer layer of shorter sleeves to show the fitted sleeves underneath. So here you can see that it's like the shorter sleeves, highly decorated on the outside, and then this under tunic with other decorative panels and embroidery on underneath. There was many jewels, belts, and collars, and ornamentation only increased throughout the entire Byzantine period. So we're gonna go through this. These are a series of drawings. So again, don't stress out too much. There's a series of drawings to look at how these things sort of changed over time. The men were starting to wear hose over this time period. So there would be a leg covering that would go along with the short tunic, so it wouldn't just be bare legs anymore. And we're also seeing this shorter tunic over the more longer fitted sleeves, and the woman's wearing a palla. In the 4th century Christian commoners, again, here we have that tunic, not really as much wrapping or fabric, because people couldn't afford that as much, whereas nobles would have some kind of headdress with a veil, some kind of belting in the middle. We're still seeing the Ionic sleeves here. And we have men with capes. And this, in particular, in the Byzantine Empire, you see a lot of this sort of decoration right at the middle here. Here's a more common Byzantine couple tunic with segmente on it. Here we have a churchgoer covering yourself up to go to services. You're seeing a little bit of the tassels decoration here, and then a noblewoman again with the veil. Another Byzantine couple. You could see this form of headdress sort of draping over the body. We're starting to see buttons and other such things on cloaks. We have in the 6th century, so we're starting to see that toga start to turn into something that's a little bit more of a sewn garment with these wide sleeves, diagonal sash. We've got 2 layers of tunic here. Here we have a 6th century noble couple. The hose are starting to become more elaborate themselves, so they start fairly simple, and then more and more embroidery, a little bit more pant-like. Also multiple layers of fabric overlapping for what starts to look a little bit like a jerkin, but is still a tunic here. We also see the Roman influence on the woman's costume, kind of resembling a stola, but moving to a wider sleeve, again, more fitted. 6th century courtiers, the more wealthy you were, the finer your fabric was, the more decoration you could have against segmente, whatnot. Here's a 7th century court performer. Now we're starting to get the very long sleeves for still the over tunic and under tunic. 8th century townspeople. So we're seeing the draping. More tunics with hose, especially the tied hose. 10th century, the court of Otto III. After 1000 AD, the silhouette changed, and tunics became even more closely fitted to the body. Although we are still also seeing overlayers of things. This is a soldier. And by the 11th century, when, and I'm not getting too much into detail here, but when restored Greek rule happens, then of course we have even more elaborately defined costumes to really drive home the point of who's in charge again. By 12th century, we have, you can see the shape has altered a little bit. This outer tunic has billowed and gotten larger with this tied belting at the middle. And the cloaks are starting to have different shapes, not just simple cloaks. They have shapes. And then the 14th century royals, still all the same style. This over tunic, almost we're just looking more and more like what we think of as church vestments. Really showing that authority. Here are different kinds of women's headgear. And we're not going to get, again, too much into detail here. Lots of veiling, lots of pearls, lots of decoration for those who are wealthy. Here's men's headgear. The other thing I want you to realize is that the Phrygian cap that I mentioned before in the Roman Empire carries through. And so this Phrygian cap is used by both men and women, but mostly men. Here's different kinds of shoes. There's also the different kinds of techniques that were used. So I suck at French. Cloisonne, I'm not saying it right, but it's an ancient technique for decorating metalwork objects. The decoration is formed by first adding compartments to the metal object by soldering or adhering silver or gold wires or thin strips placed on their edges. These remain visible on the finished piece, separating the different compartments of enamel or inlays, which are often used in several colors. Enamel objects are worked on with enamel powder made into paste and then fired in a kiln. So this is essentially what this looks like. So you've got this gold. They would build up these little barriers, these little dams, and then fill it in with the enameling so that you would have all these different colors. So this is what people would wear, as a clasp or as a piece of decoration or as a necklace. This was a common technique. This is a plaque of Saint Demetrius in 1100 using the sunk technique. There's another called Champleave, which is an enameling technique in the decorative arts, which is essentially the same process. The cells are carved or etched out of the surface metal and then filled with the enamel. The piece is then fired until the enamel fuses, and then polished after it cools. The uncarved portions of the original surface remain visible as a frame for the enamel designs. The name comes from the French for raised field meaning background, though the technique in practice lowers the area to the enameled rather than raising the rest of the surface. So this is what that looks like. And some of this is chipped out a little bit, but essentially that's the difference. So it's between that and something that ends up being a little more flat. Filigree essentially is metal lace. So just as the stonework becomes more lace-like, so does the metalwork. Jewelry was just extremely ornate, and at times items looking like coins were attached to the jewelry. This is a belt buckle from the time period. It's really beautiful artistic work. Here's your chair, your Byzantine chair. This is the chair of Bishop Maximilian, inlaid wood and ivory, Paleo-Christian sculpture from Ravenna, Italy, the Byzantine civilization in the mid-6th century. So it's just